Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual panel titled Responsible AI Transformation. In this discussion, we will go over, number one, interpretability methods and algorithmic fairness for machine learning models, the different stages of maturity as it relates to data science and analytics in an organization, what components are required to build this AI-aware organization and how to get there as soon as possible. My name is Saurabh Kumar, and I'm on the marketing team here at H2.ai. I'd love to start off by introducing our panelists for the day. James Orton. James has worked in consultancies, big enterprises, not-for-profits, and startups on predictive analytics and data science problems. His varied experience gives him a unique view on all things AI ethics, responsible, interpretable, and fair AutoML. Parul Pandey. Parul is a Kaggle Grandmaster and a data science evangelist here at H2.ai. She combines data science, evangelism, and community in her work. She has been promoting women in STEM and to that effect, recently launched a community called Women in Coding and Data Science. She is also an active writer and has contributed towards various national and international publications. SRK, Sudalai Rajkumar, better known as SRK, is a 3-time Kaggle Grandmaster and a senior data scientist at H2.ai. His diverse experience ranges from doing simple analysis on structured data to natural language processing and voice analytics in his decade-long career. His work in the NLP space is praised the world over.
Thanks, SK, for that great introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with our other panelists here. We've got a lot of expertise on the call today, which is fantastic to cover this very important topic around responsible AI transformation. And the purpose today is we're going to do kind of a quick introduction, sort of level setting in terms of our thoughts around responsible AI. So the slides will be, kind of a few minutes introduction, and then we will leave most of the time to answer the questions that you guys kindly sent through before the session, and some of the live questions to really make this kind of as interactive a session as possible. So what we'll do now is we'll just let me start with this kind of brief overview as to kind of where we see responsible AI transformation currently from H2.ai perspective. So, first of all, I just wanted to start off with kind of an introduction to why we care at H2.ai about responsible AI in particular. So we are purpose-driven, and that's part of our core values across these kind of 3 pillars that you can see on the screen. One is being a trusted partner to all of our customers around the world. We are actively engaged in the community, particularly the open source community, led by kind of our open source products that we have in that space, as well as having a keen focus on AI for good. And all of this means that responsible AI is a core part of what we do here. If you're interested in some of those AI for good projects, then you can check them out here. Some awesome organizations doing some truly kind of inspiring work. So when we think about responsible AI, this is paramount when we are thinking about models that impact humans either directly or indirectly. And we can think about this in terms of the direct component, or models that are making decisions about people, be that from things like credit risk to hiring and HR functions. All of these types of machine learning models, it's critical that we consider the implications around responsible AI. And indirectly too, right? So there are other models, things like self-driving cars you can think of as an example, where the impacts on humans could be great. So also here, responsible AI is a critical component. And when we think about responsible AI here, kind of at H2O, we try and break this down by these terms that you see on the screen here. So there are a number of kind of components to this, from explainable AI, interpretable machine learning, ethical AI, secure AI, and human-centered machine learning. And we'll unpack these further when we get to the questions section. But it's, I guess it's good kind of framework to think about how we kind of consider responsible AI here at H2O currently. But we also have to be mindful that this is constantly evolving. For instance, things like secure AI have only come up recently, and we expect this to evolve further in the months and years to come. And why should you care? Well, assuming that you are here taking part in this webinar because you have an active interest and you already do care about responsible AI. But some things to think about, in terms of why this is really an important topic for us to be discussing. In a commercial setting, you could argue that the main benefit for responsible AI is risk management, right? And avoiding that kind of reputational risk of getting it wrong. And we'll look at some of those failures that we've seen. And there are literally hundreds of examples that we could have picked, in this space. So lots of learnings that we can take from these. And there are other things to consider too. So, regulation, wherever you are in the world, I'm sure there is regulation that you need to comply to, and we see kind of a huge kind of pipeline of more regulation coming in this space. And as a foundation for responsible AI, we should make sure that we comply to any regulation that is active in your jurisdiction. And then trust, this is another big pillar of what we're doing. That can be internal. Do the people you're working with, your stakeholders, trust the solutions that you're building? Or it can be external too. Do your customers trust the way that you're using AI to make decisions about them? And then finally, robustness. And this is becoming more and more important, particularly to ensure that models are robust against attacks. So we're seeing more and more of that. Examples like people covering road signs to confuse self-driving cars, but also just robustness in general. And again, we'll dive into this more deeply as we go through the questions, but definitely an important area and a critical component to responsible AI. So, here is kind of the obligatory side on AI failures. And as I said, there are many examples. I'm sure you guys are familiar with lots of these and many others that we know of. And many of these relate to kind of breakdowns of trust, lack of robustness in terms of the ML that's being used, issues around bias and discrimination, particularly on protected variables, is a common area for failure. And AI attacks, as we mentioned, is a kind of a growing area too. So lots to consider and lots of learnings that we can potentially take from some of these examples. So now we know why we should care, but unfortunately there's no straightforward answers in responsible AI, and that's why we're kind of having these webinars and having these discussions. For example, even within the kind of subgroup of explainable AI, what does it mean to explain? Are you explaining it to me? Are we explaining it to everyone on the webinar, or just the data scientists, or are you explaining it to my kids? And what are we explaining? Is it the model overall, or a specific decision that the model makes? We can see that within the term explainable alone, there's a lot to unpack. So a lot for us to discuss as we move into the panel discussion too. The good news is that many of our customers are already actively working through this, and we can discuss and potentially learn from some of those experiences too, as you go on your journey through AI transformation. And then finally, before we get to answering some of your questions, I just wanted to point you guys in the direction of some of good resources that we have in this area freely available on our website. This booklet on interpretability has tons of examples around trust, post hoc explanations, and interpretability. So if you're interested in any of those concepts, I definitely recommend checking this out, and we'll share the link after the session. And then kind of lastly, another new document that we have that you can get from our website relating to responsible AI for credit is a great resource if you're in that space, or even if you're not. Some learnings here, I'm sure, for any industry. When we do a lot of great work with banking and financial services, as you can imagine, this is a high stakes area where getting it right is super, super critical, and definitely a resource I suggest checking out. And again, we will share the link to this in the description to this webinar. And with that, I'd like to hand over, and let's get started with some of these questions that we have from the audience.
Thank you, James, for that powerful summary. Let's get to the questions. Number one, I want panelists' views on AI's discriminatory case on gender. For example, we have seen a certain credit card company, from an example James just mentioned, giving less line to females than their male counterparts. Can Parul kick it off?
Yeah, thanks, Saurabh. And this is actually a very interesting question. And It's a lot that we hear that, the AI is biased and AI is discriminatory and so on. So a very important point to understand here is that, see, AI is just a tool. Machine learning algorithms are just tools, and we use them to sort of, solve some real problems that are happening. Now, how do they perform depends largely upon a lot of factors. What sort of data set are they being trained on? And is the data set on which they are being trained inherently biased? So it's just like whatever you'll feed in, and that's going to be the representation of what you'll get. So having said that, yes, recently I think we've been hearing a lot about the discriminatory nature of some of these cards, credit cards. And for the ones who do not have idea about it, I'll just like to give a little context. So a few months back, there was a Twitter thread, and which actually caused a lot of uproar in the Twitter community about a person who said that the credit limit of his wife was about like 20 times lower than his. And despite, like almost, she had a better credit score. And then we saw slowly and slowly more Twitter users, they came in and they said, yes, this is also the case with us. As compared to our husbands, our credit score is fairly low. And when all this was happening, the question was put forward to the company. And a very interesting answer from the company was that, this is not possible because we do not use gender as a feature in our algorithms. And so our models are gender blind. And if we are not feeding gender as a feature, how can our models discriminate against gender, or say race in that case? So this is a very important, you could say, learning that we can have, that even if gender is not a feature that we use for training our algorithms, we might have other features in a data set which are sort of correlated with gender. And those proxies can have a disastrous effect on a model when it comes to getting biased models. And for instance, in this case, some of the people highlighted that maybe so when a person applies for a credit card, there are a lot of details the person has to put. And maybe the buying history of the person. So, females, the buying pattern is different from males. And probably it was inferring from that, the gender. And this is very easy and this is very common. So algorithms, they need to be audited. And we have to see that before we put our models into production, they have to be rigorously tested for any bias that has crept into it. And we also have to make sure that the data sets that we are using are free of bias, because then ultimately what we will get is the representation of what we fed into it. So that's my take on this whole fiasco.
Awesome. Oh yeah, thanks for also just to add, like say, just to give my views on the discrimination. So yeah, obviously like with more and more AI transformation that has been happening like off late, so we need to take more care about the responsibility with respect to the discrimination, like with respect to gender as well as like race and age and all types of discrimination in the first place. So like so that's what like we call it as fairness, like in responsible AI, and like that's a very big piece of responsible AI as well. So like Parul I mean mentioned really good about the like discrimination with respect to structured data. So since I work on the unstructured data, so like couple of examples from there is like if there is a in NLP, one thing I have seen is like say if there is a hate speech detection algorithm. So like in some cases like just that like if someone mentions like I am straight, or someone mentions like I support LGBTQ, so there's a high chance that like just due to the word LGBTQ it flags that as a hate speech, and as a result like the voice of that particular like group itself gets reduced, or like not being portrayed to the external world. So such kind of things should not be discriminated, and we need to ensure fairness like across different groups. So and like say that's with respect to NLP. Like with respect to image, like we use a lot of facial recognition systems these days. So if the models are trained only on a particular set of people, like from a particular race or a people between age 30 to 50, then it won't like really work well for other type of people. So these are some of the discriminatory things that we need to take care of. And as Parul rightly mentioned, there are two ways we could mitigate this. One is via the data, like we could take care of that in the data space itself, like and correct it over there. But even then, as in the credit card example, like it could creep into the model building process. So we could also, like once we build the model, like we need to take care of the modeling bias, where we could see in each of these different subgroups like how our model is performing, and we need to like take an action based on that if needed. So that's my take.
Yeah, it's a really difficult, you know, particularly bias is a really difficult thing to deal with. You know, I think we've all kind of experienced that, you know, on the call, and the example even kind of within gender bias. There was another example that I saw recently in the HR space where, you know, there was gender bias against women, even though they weren't, you know, again, using that as a variable. This issue of proxies is massive because, you know, anything contained within a CV can be used to potentially identify gender. You know, it might be the clubs that you attend, or the, you know, the particular types of roles that you go for. So very, very difficult kind of issues to unpick, but we, you know, absolutely need to in the data. And, you know, as SRK mentioned, at the kind of, you know, the post hoc stage in terms of explainability, the disparate impact across those different variables. So a difficult topic, but many kind of, yeah, many learnings that we already have that we can use to avoid that, you know, going forward.
Thank you, everybody. Now, leading into the same topic, you know, there's this member who's asked, I face a number of issues. Number one, the black box nature of AI and the iterative process of producing models can be very troubling for customers. This, along with data collection and sharing, is also an issue for me. How can you, what can you recommend that'll help me alleviate some of my pain points?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with that. There's a lot to unpack there, so a lot of issues, and we'll try and take each one by one. And you know, guys, jump in as well. You know, if you have any kind of thoughts on this too. Firstly, black box. You know, is a term that we hear often. It's an interesting one, kind of for me. I think the challenge is what level of understanding is required for what stakeholder, and what is, you know, what is appropriate to build responsible AI. And it's probably not absolute full understanding for everyone involved in that process, but definitely probably more understanding than we see today. So I would say that data literacy is a key area which organizations are investing in now. So we see that kind of actively being you know, kind of a growth area, and definitely important that people can communicate internally about data, you know, efficiently and well. So that's an interesting area, and I think you could think about that as well, kind of in the concept of computer literacy, perhaps, you know, 30 years ago. You would kind of, you know, back then you would have kind of your IT specialists, and, you know, other people would know not very much about computers. Now we all know enough, right, to use a computer successfully. Doesn't mean we all know how to fix computers, but we are comfortable, you know, in that world. Whereas kind of we're still, I think there's some challenges in the data space that we need to overcome in terms of data literacy. So that's one area that I think is, you know, is evolving. And there are technical ways as well we can address this issue around black box AI. And one is kind of the post hoc techniques that we sort of, you know, talked about briefly in the previous question. And the one, you know, there are many, and, you know, using our tool Driverless AI here at H2O with a full set of kind of suite of tools that you can use in that space. But one that I see is particularly powerful for our customers here kind of in the region is using Shapley values, particularly when tree-based models are built on structured data. And these can be really powerful. So if you think kind of the example of a model making recommendations internally within an organization, you can make a recommendation, hey, you know, this product or whatever is useful for this customer, and these are the reasons why. So you take quite a complex mathematical concept like Shapley values and kind of distill that down into something that's understandable for the person that needs to use that, the output of that model in their work. So that's kind of a very interesting area that we're seeing kind of our customers working on. The other one, from a technical perspective in terms of addressing black boxes is using more interpretable models. So again, within our kind of tool set, there are ways in which we can approach more interpretable models, and a lot of work in this area as well, evolving just in the space of more interpretable techniques. Let's move on. I'll move on to the second part. So the next part was ability to iterate quickly, right? So that's important, I think, for responsible AI and AI transformation in general. And typically that's where a tool like driverless AI can be very powerful in terms of ability to help create efficiency within that process. But it is absolutely critical that for a data scientist to be able to iterate through that process efficiently, whilst still maintaining best practice. And I suggest the ways to do that are to look at some particular tools that may help you to do that. And there's no way of avoiding that iterative process that I found in my experience in data science. And then last point on that kind of first part of the question, I would say, is around kind of managing expectations. When you say this is kind of troubling for customers, what I would say is that there's two sides to this, particularly in the kind of responsible AI space. There's a small cost of upfront investment in doing things the right way and aligning to responsible AI, versus the potential large cost of getting it wrong. Are you prepared to take that risk of the kind of AI failure that you may see in a few months and to come from that model? So definitely something to be done there in terms of kind of the expectations of stakeholders. And the last one, kind of the data. I mean, this is a whole kind of new set of problems, and they probably could have a whole webinar on data privacy, collection, sharing, etc. Many things to unpack there. But it's definitely important, right? And how we do this, and I would add to that too. The data part, we can spend a lot of time talking about algorithmic approaches, but data is also critical. And I'd add to that to say that here, exploratory analysis is kind of often overlooked, but a critical part of responsible AI is getting that initial understanding of your data right too. Then there's a lot that can be learned from that process before even any machine learning models are built.
Yeah, so I'll just like to add. When people say that it's more troubling for the customers, there could be one reason that what we always think is that responsible AI is only for data scientists, and we could just use this just a mechanism to make sure that your whole machine learning model is not biased. On the other hand, I think responsible AI should be imbibed into the core philosophy of a company, and not something that could be plugged at the end of your whole pipeline and only when the model has to go out in production. So right from the business users to the CEOs and the CXOs to the data engineers and data scientists, all of them sort of have to be sensitized about the importance of ethics and responsible AI, because this is something that is not only it's the need of the hour, it's the right thing to do. And when you are creating models for healthcare, for financial institutions, you have to make sure that it is going to affect humans. And when anything is going to affect humans, I think you have to be extra careful, and you have to think in that way, and think of responsible AI as something essential that has to be in your product pipeline.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Following up on the same lines, so I guess that responsible AI is now the mainstream of AI transformation, because every stakeholder of the transformation will not want the black box model. I know it touches upon the previous question itself, but if I could quickly get 2 cents from the panelists on black box, responsible AI, and AI transformation, how do they tie in together?
Yeah, so let me give a take on this one first. So like as James and Parul rightly mentioned, so like this AI transformation is something that has to do with the all the stakeholders, like which is mentioned in the question as well, like all the stakeholders of the company, and like say from an interpretability standpoint, so there are a lot of ways which we could make a black box model into something more interpretable, like the SHAP line that James mentioned like previously. So there are quite a few ways like SHAP and line that we could use to make the black box models like more white box, or like say more interpretable. So and apart from that, like say, since it also so the reason being, like since now that with AI transformation being the core philosophy of the organization, as Parul mentioned, like say every stakeholder needs to be needs to understand what's happening. So only when we make this, like say, these models like as more interpretable, as more transparent, then like everyone will be able to understand, say, like this being a business user. If you are a business user or a CXO, then like you also need to understand, like say, transparently what's happening inside the model. So that's when like we could use that for our any of our business decisions. So this transparency should also go to, like say, even for the end user, I would say for example, say if we use any machine learning model, so then we should also let the end customer know that, like, okay, so this is something that is being done by a machine learning model or a AI system. For example, say if there is a chatbot and if you are talking to a machine instead of a person at the other end, then probably like it's we need to be transparent over that. We need to mention that, okay, so you are talking to a chatbot now and not really to a human being, because that will also improve the satisfaction of the customer or the expectation of the customer that, oh, okay, so this is something I'm chatting to a AI system. So that's another thing. And so yeah, and one other thing, like say when we do this AI transformation, like when especially when there are multiple stakeholders, like say the accountability or the responsibility, like which is more like say I think like that will come up more a lot in the future, because like say whenever something goes wrong, that's when like say we'll be worried a lot. So if something goes wrong, then we need to be prepared, as in like say if some decision has been taken wrongly by an AI system, then like who is held responsible? So it should not be like the data scientist who build the model should only be responsible, or the product manager. So all these things needs to be taken care of. Like say when it involves multiple stakeholders, it should not be like say one stakeholder pointing finger to the other one. So these are some of the other points that needs to be taken care of from my view. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would add to that. So, I would say that just kind of a quick comment, from the slides earlier, really when we're talking about stakeholders and their role within kind of AI transformation and responsible AI transformation, trust is the cornerstone to success. Without trust across the organization and your customers, then your AI project's going to run into trouble. So making sure we build that trust internally, externally, and maintain that trust is very, very important. As SRK mentioned there, in relation to kind of chatbots, being explicit about when we're using AI and when we're not, so that that our customers can have that trust with us. But there are many aspects of that trust part, which I think is very important in this transformation process.
Thank you both of you. Our next question asks, does being more responsible or ethical with AI adoption mean my company will have to sacrifice accuracy or predictive power?
Yeah, so I think I can comment on that. So now there is a trade-off between accuracy and interpretability, obviously, because if you see at linear models, they are highly interpretable, but they might not be as accurate as, say, deep learning models, which on the other hand are like black boxes, and they have been notoriously called as black boxes because you have a hard time explaining their predictions. Now, when we say that, there are tools available. I think James had also mentioned about SHAP, and there are post hoc tools which could be used for post hoc analysis, which we can use after a model has been trained to explain the predictions. And for instance, like surrogate models are there. So what surrogate models are there? What they do is you will train your model using the black box as complex as you want. And once you get the predictions, Then you use a simpler model, say a decision tree. Now a decision tree is highly interpretable. So again, you will use the same training data for the decision tree, but instead of using the target, you are going to use the predictions of that complex model. So these surrogate models like SHAP and K-LIME, so LIME stands for Local Interpretable Model Agnostic Explanation. And we have our own H2O's version called K-LIME in driverless AI. These are such powerful models because they could explain the predictions of any model. So they are like model agnostic. And a very interesting thing I like to mention is why it is important actually to explain the predictions. So the authors of, so the creators of LIME wrote a paper called Why Should I Trust You? And they sort of give a very interesting example to explain the importance of interpretability. So an image classifier was created to actually identify whether an animal is a wolf or a husky. So, and now we used LIME. So LIME locally is a local tool, and it helps to give a more understanding in local explanations. So for one of the prediction, the model had incorrectly classified a wolf as a husky. So they used LIME to understand why it was doing so. And what interestingly came out was that it was not the features of the animals which were used for differentiating between a wolf or a husky. So whether the shape of the ears or maybe the color of the eyes. On the other hand, it was the snow in the background. So the image classifier was using the snow in the image to classify whether the photograph is of images of a wolf or a husky. And this is so dangerous because this is something that you would not want. So then what we could do is, now since we know that the classifier is using the background snow, so we could add more huskies with snow in the background to our training set. And similarly, we could add more wolves without snow. So it is in these cases where, you know, interpretability becomes more important. And now this was just a simple example of a wolf, but let's say even if a YouTube algorithm recommends some videos which we won't like, okay, we won't like that video, but it won't have the, those bad repercussions. But imagine if we are denied a credit card, or if we are denied health insurance based on such decisions, that might have a very dangerous effect. So like I said, LIME, there are PDPs, partial dependence plots, which are also used in driverless AI, which actually show how the prediction changes when you change some of the parameters. And so these are some of the tools that we can use. So you can train your model on complex, you can use complex models, but then you can use these tools to actually interpret as to what the predictions and what the predictions mean. I think James and SRK would also add on that.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe I can jump in. Oh, sorry, SRK. I just wanted to, there's a couple of points I wanted to talk about there that Parul mentioned. First one, that I love that example of the, you know, the husky and the wolf and the snow. It's a really, you know, it's a very powerful one, and really kind of, you know, shows that kind of issue around lack of robustness, and how responsible AI can really help you build more robust models, which is absolutely what we need to do, you know, for many reasons, including being responsible in terms of AI. That AI model, you know, released into production would be no good. So, you know, that's kind of important. But I also wanted to just slightly disagree with you, kind of on your point about this direct trade-off between interpretability and accuracy. Just you know, because this is a really kind of evolving space. I'd be interested to hear SRK's thoughts on this too. There are lots of interpretable models coming out these days, you know, beyond kind of the basic ones that we probably all know and understand around kind of decision trees and linear regression, but things like FAIR, XGBoost, explainable boosting machines from Microsoft, explainable neural networks from some of the team here too, are all you know, worth looking into. And I would suggest, you know, if you're practicing responsible AI, that you need to, you know, become familiar with these evolving techniques and try them also, right? So there are so many ways that we can approach even kind of simple, you know, structured data, binary classification style problems the types of algorithms and approaches that we could take are infinite, and hence why tools like driverless AI are very useful. But we should also consider, some of these more interpretable techniques, as well as some of the potentially less interpretable techniques, side by side, and compare, what we get kind of as from a performance point of view. And there might be a trade-off, but I think you absolutely need to go through that process in every use case that you develop. And you need to consider that in terms of the machine learning metrics themselves, but also in terms of kind of the business value too. Like, what is the business value of this X% increase in AUC that you might get from a more, a less interpretable model versus, the trade-off of having a greater understanding. So I think there's that trade-off is kind of famous and well known, and there are obviously examples where that holds true, but I think in every use case you need to you really kind of explore that deeply yourself to make sure that it is true in your case as well.
Yeah. So to summarize, so like as Parul and James mentioned, like say both ways it's possible. So like say one way is like say we could build a model and then use interpretation techniques to to see how this model is performing, and say whether it is interpretable, whether all the variables that we are using in the model and the transformations are say making sense, and it's good. So that's one way. And the second way, as James mentioned, is say we could build an inherently interpretable model in the first place. So that's another thing we could do. And say as James was mentioning, so if we want to build a fair model or an interpretable model, so it's from a technical standpoint, it's more say consider if we build a regression model, linear regression or a regression model. So where if we have more number of variables, so we also add a weightage for L1 or L2 regularization, right? So that becomes part of the optimization function. So that optimizes for the number of variables as well. So similarly, I have seen when people build models for fairness or discrimination, so there's a error term that's being added for the fairness. So we also give some weightage to the fairness in addition to whatever we are optimizing for example, say log loss or RMSE. So that say that weightage is also something that we could change, say if how much weightage should be given to fairness compared to the accuracy. So that way we could also do a trade-off manually when we build such fair models or the interpretable models as well. Thanks.
Thank you for
sorry.
Go on,
SK,
James.
I just wanted to make a final comment. Just another thought that I had, on that topic too, is actually, because a breakdown in accuracy too. So, from the other side, if you choose to put in a model into production, which we know is less accurate, there's a responsible AI implication there too. If your model is doing something very sensitive, like say credit risk, and you're putting a model that you can understand better, but is actually less accurate into production, what's the cost of that as well? In terms of denying or approving credit to people in the wrong scenario. So there's so much to weigh up, in that topic. I think it's a very, very challenging one.
True.
Thank you, James. Next question. Text classification algorithms are at the heart of a variety of software systems that process text data at scale. Today, we see huge amounts of text data in forms of user reviews, emails, chats, text messages, etc., etc. What are some of the tools or algorithms for responsible or interpretable AI in text?
Awesome. Okay. So being working on the text, say probably I'll take this question first and then link to Parul and James to add our comment on that one. So great. So yeah, so following the tradition of being interpretable and responsible for all types of data, so there have been quite a few improvements that have been happening on the text side as well. So for example, say if we take driverless AI, so when we do text classification, so we could do things say loco, which is leave one covariate out. So for the interpretation, so what we will do is we will drop one word at a time. So just to see how important that word is. So by that means we'll be able to get how much important is each of these words, and like say how much are they contributing to the prediction. So like once we look at those, then we'll be able to understand like what are all the weightages that we are giving to each of these words in the while doing the classification. So logo is one thing, and one other very good tool that we have inside Iterate is sensitivity analysis. So like sensitivity analysis is more like a, what we could do with that is like a, given a sentence, and if we have a prediction, so we could play around with it, like say how sensitive our pipeline is or our model is. Say like for example, say if we can change something from it is good to it is not good, and then see like how it is affecting the prediction. So or we could change a word to a relative word, or we could just keep an opposite meaning of that word and see like how the prediction change. So this also helps understand like how the model is performing, and also help us to say look at the robustness of the model, as James was mentioning. So sensitivity analysis and logo are a couple of tools that we have inside Iterate currently. So we could use that to interpret any text-based models, and like so these are directly like kind of a model that can work on any pipelines. So as such, and like say that, I mean, of late there are also a lot of tools that has come up. Say like for example, say in the open source domain we have Captum. So that like say in case if we have a deep learning model, and if we want to understand like say which words contribute to the outcome. So for example, in Captum, we have a lot of ways like layer integrated gradients, or deep lift or shape to see like which words are contributing to the like the prediction. So that's Captum is one thing that comes to my mind. And yeah, interpret text is another package. So that I've seen, like say which helps with text. So interpret text. So these are some of the packages so that will help in the interpretation part of the NLP, like with respect to the interpretation part. So then there is like off late, like recently, like in the last month. So there's a very good paper by Samir Singh et al. So and they also released a package called Checklist. So this checklist is a package by like Samir Singh and other researchers. So that will also help in like interpreting as well as the checking the robustness of our model. So like it helps in seeing like say how robust are our models when we change some of these words or change some of the meanings of the sentences, and like say and measuring how our models behave with respect to the change in these inputs. So these are some of the tools and algorithms that will be really helpful, like especially when we deal with text. And I'm sure like this is a very evolving field, so we always need to have a eye or keep a tab on this one, so as to see like what comes next tomorrow. So yeah, it's a very interesting space, I would say. Thanks.
Thank you, SRK. Our next question, we hear multiple different terms referring to possibly the same thing, such as responsible AI, ethical AI, interpretability of ML models, etc. Can you explain if there's a distinction between these, Parul?
So I think James had touched upon this in his presentation, where we saw a sort of a Venn diagram, and there's a circular center, and there's written responsible AI. So responsible AI is sort of an umbrella term. And then there are a lot of different, you could say, types of it when it comes to, and we could further break it down into a lot of other terms. And so like one of the way responsible AI works, one could be explainable AI. So explainable AI is what I was explaining initially, that once you create a model and you give explanation about that model after it has been created. On the other hand, I think what James referred to was creating interpretable architecture. So that's interpretable machine learning. And one very good example that now I would like to give is about explainable boosting machines. So this has been this work of Microsoft, and EBMs are created in such a way that they are inherently interpretable. So you don't have to give explanation once the model has been formed, and their performance is as good as gradient boosting machines, but they are white boxes, as you can say. So this is one example of those transparent model alternatives that we can have. Ethical AI is another component of responsible AI, and it's about sociological fairness in machine learning. You know, when you have to make sure that you're not giving weightage to one race over the other or one gender over the other. Secure AI, again, it was also mentioned before. It's about debugging and deploying models against cyber threats that has become pretty common nowadays. And lastly, human-centered AI, which I think is very important. And it's about the user interactions with AI and ML systems. So all of these, and this is not like stationary or it's fixed. Since this field is evolving, you're going to have many more subfields of responsible AI in the future. And these were some of the main ones that I can think of at the moment. Would love to have James and SRK add on to these.
Yeah, so I just make a quick comment. I think you've covered it very well, Parul. But just a quick comment. They're all interesting, right, and evolving. But particularly, personally, I'm kind of very interested in this concept of human-centered AI. I think it's kind of relatively new, but very important, kind of across the board. Wherever humans interact with AI systems, how do we kind of make sure that interaction is centered and prioritizes the human in the loop? So there's lots of work, that's kind of evolving and coming in that area, but I think it's kind of a very, very interesting and will become, more and more important. And then in kind of interpretable models too, I think again, mentioned EBMs there, explainable boosting machines, they're very, very powerful technique, and one that personally I got quite excited about, about a year ago, and there are more coming in that space, and it's I think that as well will be very kind of interesting and evolving. I think I mentioned before, Fair XGBoost is a relatively new one, also kind of interesting to look into, but a lot of these tree-based methods for kind of kind of IID data are kind of evolving and very, very powerful. So I think we'll see a continuation of that, in the months ahead. Yeah, and I'd be interested in SRK's take on any kind of techniques that he's aware of or components of responsible AI that you think are kind of important.
Yeah, I hope like you both covered almost all of that one, so I don't have much to add for this.
Thank you. So people talk about COVID breaking models because the past data does not correlate with the current reality. Do you think there is truth to this, or what's different now, or what will be different after COVID?
Maybe I'll start with a quick one, and
Please.
then the other guys chip in. So I think that's very real, right? That we've seen this with our customers. There are a number of models that have been kind of severely impacted in production because of the changing nature of the input data, because of the changing nature of human behavior. So is there truth in it? I would say absolutely. Kind of look around you. How have people's behaviors and habits changed in the last few months? I know, for instance, kind of me in particular, I haven't kind of left within 5K of my house in what seems like months. So, that's a different kind of behavior, right? There's different things that people are buying, because of these changing behaviors. So there's lots that's kind of happened there. Lots has changed in terms of what we're doing, which means lots has changed within the data, which means that, models which were built on that past data are probably not going to be as valid. Now, maybe things will return to normal at some point, but at this point, I would say we're in a very different phase, and we can probably expect more volatility in the coming months as, kind of across geographies. We see some places opening up, some places having second waves, or still in kind of their first wave. It's kind of a different experience around the globe, but there is I definitely think we can expect more kind of volatility there, and probably some long-term change. Kind of people talk about that, particularly regarding things like working from home. That's going to become potentially more common. That's going to have an impact in lots of the data that that we see and that we analyze. So yeah, I mean, I would say kind of anything related to predicting the economy or consumer behavior, their attention will be required. And again, I think this links back to what we talked about previously around robustness of models. if you know the models that you have currently in production and how they were built, what they're using as kind of important variables, then you'll know if they're going to break, because you'll have that kind of clear understanding about how they use the input data and make those predictions. So that robustness will help people understand what impact COVID will have on their models. And just kind of on that topic of robustness as well, there's one other thing that I kind of wanted to add, in terms of the discussion that we've been having and the techniques, that the other guys have mentioned too, around Lime, Shapley values, partial dependence plots, many techniques, out there we can use kind of from a post-hoc point of view. And really, when we talk about robustness, it's also about kind of making sure that there's a story there and that they broadly agree. Shap values I love, but over-reliance on one particular technique also could potentially lead to a lack of robustness. So I'd say, in terms of the breaking models, make sure that you understand your models well, you have that robustness, and then you'll know if they're likely to break.
Sure. Oh,
Thank
yeah,
you, James.
those are really good points, James. So, yeah, so great. So, so like come to like a COVID breaking models here. So, like one thing is, as James mentioned, so there's been a lot of behavioral shift that has happened over the last few months, and as a result, like that would be a lot of drift in the data as well. So, also someone mentioned in the question, so like is data drift an issue? So, like say through the interpretation or through the model understanding, what we need to do is like we could look at the predictions distribution to see like is there any change in our model, the distribution of our model prediction, like with respect to before COVID and after COVID. So if there is a huge shift in the distribution, then like we could see that like that's something that not intended has been going on now. So that's a change in the data, or like say change in something. That's why like our models are having a completely different distribution compared to what it was before. So that way we will be able to figure out that like say that there is something like the model is not doing well. So if we see that, then like what we could do is like as James mentioned, we could go and look at these individual variables to look at the drift of these variables to understand like which ones are actually causing it. So are there any significant variables that are in our models that's causing this drift? And like say then we need to take a decision on whether that is something that is expected or not. So based on the business knowledge as well, then we need to take a call on whether we need to rebuild our models because of this change in shift, or if there is no change in drift at all, then like say we are good in our use case. So it also depends on use case to use case basis. Thanks.
Thank you, both of you. Next question. What are your views on data privacy and security as more and more data gets collected every day?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So, yeah, so like especially like when we talk about responsible AI, ethical AI, so like and we as we are moving to the digital age, and like we are like in digital platforms like throughout the day. So like more and more data gets collected, and like say I would say both as both the the people who are collecting the data needs to be responsible, as well as the end user, we as a customer, we also needs to be responsible. So like especially like the privacy kind of things like play a major role in something like say healthcare or even banks. So like as Parul was mentioning, if something like sensitive is there in the data, then we need to be like really taken care of. For example, say a very good example say is something like a few years back, like Target. There is a very famous article like say Target was able to find out that a teen girl was pregnant even before her father was able to do that, because like due to the data, like due to the buying patterns, it was able to identify. So is that something like a intrusion of privacy? Like yes, obviously. I mean, I would say yes, because like so like as a responsible AI, say like we need to take care of the use cases or the things that we do. So it should not go into the privacy of the the user. So that's a very important thing. And also like say like we also as an end user needs to be careful and like say try to use that. Try to not use. Try to read the data privacy terms and be like as safe as we can. And also like with respect to security, which is the second part, like that's also very important these days, because like as more and more data gets collected, so the organization needs to have a very secure system, which also James mentioned in the slides. So like say, or else like if there is a data breach, then that's something like that's a very huge loss for a company, be it a financial services or any company, because it brings in a lot of legal implications. So that's one thing. And also like apart from that, among the customers, the brand name will get tarnished. So that has a huge repercussion. So we need to be really careful about the data security, and we need to have proper things in place, like say as part of responsible AI. So yeah, that those are my views. Like I'll let James and Parul add.
Yeah, I think you've already mentioned the most important points. As we say today, data is the new oil, and data has a lot of power. But then with that power comes lots and lots of responsibilities. The companies also have to ensure that they do not have some personal identifiable information in the data set, or there shouldn't be any features, that like for instance gender and race, which cannot be used in any business context, and the minority population are sufficiently represented. And as users, we also have to make sure, we have to understand, that what is the information that we are putting out there into the world. We are putting about thousands and lakhs of selfies on the internet every day, and we need to understand what is the limit and what is the trade-off for that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, all this, these topics around privacy and security are kind of all related to ethical AI, and, some kind of like high level considerations. As the guys mentioned, you've got to consider what data you should put into a model, and there's a certain data that shouldn't go in, or as well as kind of proxies for that data. That's kind of one consideration. And then the other consideration is really kind of, should the model be built at all? Is this the right use case given the data? So there's lots to consider, I think, in that space, in terms of kind of what data we can and can't use, and whether models are appropriate in that scenario.
Thank you, both of you. We have 2 minutes left. We'll try to squeeze in 2 questions. Number one, how technically sound does a C-suite stakeholder has to be before he or she can understand the explanations?
Maybe I'll take a very quick stab at this one. So again, I think this kind of relates back to the data literacy point that we made before. I think that's important to have data literacy throughout an organization. So that's important. But then also, from the data scientist point of view, make sure that your explanations are also human-centered, right? Consider your audience. If you are talking to a CXO about a model, they have kind of limited time and bandwidth to understand what you are doing. So make sure you present those things that are truly relevant to them, so that they can digest and understand it. There's a lot there, kind of, as we mentioned before, particularly around being human-centered, about how we kind of, you do that as a technical person, but also as an organization, how you upskill around kind of data literacy. So many components to that.
Thank you, James. Possibly our last question. After watching The Social Dilemma on Netflix and watching Yuval Noah Harari's lectures on the future of humanity, I feel I am responsible for this as a data scientist. So there's a responsible AI, now there's a responsible data scientist. Do you want to take that, Parul?
So I think, again, like I mentioned in the starting, see, AI and machine learning, they're very powerful tools, and they have the ability to solve a lot of problems. It's just like any other tool, and they have to be used responsibly. And yes, as data scientists, we should make sure that we're using it in a way that that's responsible, and that's for social good. So the most important part is having human in the loop. AI, automation, all these tools are given to humans for them to use and make a better use out of these tools. So that is something that you have to keep in mind, that humans are required in the loop.
Wonderful. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Do you have concluding thoughts, James, SRK, Parul?
This is a wonderful thing. Like there are a lot of interesting questions. So yeah, and this is an evolving field, like as James and Parul mentioned. So we always need to keep an eye on that one. Like say, as a technical person as well as a CXO, so like we need to keep a tab on this one and see how it evolves and how to incorporate that in our organization. So yeah, that will be my takeaway.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for all the great questions. It's been a pleasure to be part of the panel and hear everyone else's views too. It's been really enjoyable. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it's been wonderful, great questions and great topic. And I think we all now pretty much understand that we have a lot of responsibility as people working in machine learning sector to make sure that the models that we're creating, the predictions of those are fair and not discriminating.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of you for taking the time, and thank you to your audience for taking the time again and asking all those wonderful questions. We will touch base very soon again with the next webinar and our virtual meetup. Till then, have a good day. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, SK, for being a wonderful host.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.